Hey there, my name is Grant, and you're watching episode 4 of my History of the Jewish Peoples series. Today we are looking at the Israelite conquest of Canaan, or perhaps it's more accurate to call it the settlement of Canaan, or perhaps the whole thing is a myth. Let's get started. So like the previous episodes, let's start with the biblical narrative. After the Exodus, the Israelites are said to have wandered through the desert for 40 years. By the end of that period, most of the original generation that had left Egypt was dead, including their leader Moses, who was succeeded by Joshua. Joshua would lead the military campaign into Canaan. They crossed the Jordan River into the land and came to their first battle at the city of Jericho.
What are you doing?
We're going to knock your wall down.
By walking around in circles?
Yes.
The Israelites form an alliance with the Gibeonites, who convinced the Israelites that they were not among the Canaanites whom God had ordered them to exterminate. An alliance of Amorite cities, led by the Canaanite king of Jerusalem, forms to resist the Israelites, but are defeated in battle with the aid of divine intervention. Another anti-Israelite alliance is formed in the north and led by the king of Hazor, but they too are defeated in battle, and the city of Hazor is destroyed. After the defeat of the Canaanites, the land of Canaan was divided up amongst the 12 Israelite tribes. The tribes of Reuben and Gad were given lands east of the Jordan River, which the Israelites had conquered before their invasion of Canaan, while the rest of the tribes were given land west of the Jordan River. Upon Joshua's death, the tribes remained in a loose confederation led by local leaders called judges, who orchestrated campaigns against the non-Canaanites still in the land, the Philistines. It was the fight against the Philistines that unified the Israelites into a single kingdom, but we're stopping the narrative just short of that for this episode. Okay, so the traditional narrative around the Israelite takeover of Canaan is very much in line with stories of the time period. A rapid conquest of the land via military victories. But how much of this can be said to be true? Well, like much of the earlier parts of the Hebrew Bible, you can't really prove the historicity of the characters mentioned. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't exist. What it does mean, however, is that we have to be honest about the historical and archaeological record as it currently exists. Okay then, how do academics see the conquest of Canaan? Well, there are 4 models typically used when looking at it. The conquest model, the peaceful infiltration model, the peasants revolt model, and the agricultural resettlement model, sometimes referred to as the invisible Israelites model. Each of these models tries a different method of rationalizing the archaeological and textual sources, with varying degrees of concern for the biblical narrative. The conquest model holds the most esteem for the traditional narrative. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists excavated sites across Palestine, one of which being the most famous conquest, Jericho. Some of these earlier excavations found that the city was indeed fortified with walls, and at some point they were burned down. Similar instances were found at many of the other sites mentioned in the biblical narrative. These sites also showed evidence of having been reoccupied by a new culture at some point after their walls were burned down. The problem with this model, however, is the chronology. As mentioned in the previous episode, the earliest known reference to the Israelites as a distinct entity came from the Merneptah stele, around 1207 BCE. The conquest of Canaan is believed to have happened in the late 13th century BCE. However, the exact message of the stele references the defeat of the Israelites. They may not have been overwhelmingly defeated like the stele claims, but they must have suffered some kind of setback. There's also the problem that the 13th century was the strongest period for the New Kingdom Egypt, especially for its presence in Canaan, which it controlled at the time, which makes a sudden rapid conquest by a semi-nomadic tribe less likely. On top of that, the archaeological evidence doesn't support the chronology. Yes, a number of cities mentioned in the text were burnt down at some point, but most of those burnings were 200 plus years prior to when the conquest would have taken place. And during the times of the conquest, most of the mentioned sites were scantily populated. Okay, then what about the peaceful infiltration model? In contrast to the previous theory, this model believes that the Israelite takeover of Canaan was gradual and mostly peaceful. This model is backed up by some of the biblical texts, such as the peace made with the Gibeonites, as well as the lack of battle descriptions for the conquest of central Canaan in the book of Joshua. It proposes that the Israelites were a semi-nomadic group that gradually transitioned into a more sedentary culture, which came into conflict with the local Canaanite groups over land. They believe the evidence of the burned down cities can be attributed to attacks by the Sea Peoples, mentioned in the histories of the Bronze Age collapse. This model proposes that the Book of Joshua is an teleological text, which is concerned with giving explanations for why things are the way it is. However, this model is often criticized for relying too much on the teleological method, especially when there is a surprising amount of accurate details given in the biblical text. So then what about the Peasants revolt model? Well, this model argues that the Israelites were not a nomadic group at all, but rather were a class of people living in Canaan. This model contends that the tribes in ancient times were groups based around social class rather than genealogy. In this interpretation, the conquest is really a peasant revolt in which peoples living in rural areas overthrew the urban rulers. If you remember the theories covered in episode 1, this sounds a lot like the Habaru theory coming from the Amarna letters. Well, this theory does indeed come out of that one. Some proponents of the theory incorporate some of the Exodus narrative into it, believing that a tribe coming out of Egypt, this time a religiously oriented one, was practicing a monotheistic religion, and when they tried to settle in Canaan, they were turned away by the Canaanite rulers. They then led the local peasants in rebellion against the cities and conquered the land for the workers. This theory was developed in the 60s and was influenced by Marxism and Leninism. It's very Marxist in that it reinterprets the evidence to be about class conflict, and it's very Leninist in its assertion that some kind of vanguard or revolutionary leadership was needed to spark revolt. This theory is heavily criticized for placing a modern construct like class on peoples in the ancient world, who would have been far more concerned with familial links than those of economic status. So then, what about the last theory, the agricultural resettlement model? This model is a modification of the peaceful infiltration model, in that it holds that the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites was gradual and mostly peaceful. In contrast to the peaceful infiltration model, however, it believes that there is a kernel of truth to the Exodus and conquest narratives. It believes the bulk of the Israelite population remained in the land of Canaan, where a small portion have spent some time in Egypt. When the Egyptians began to militarily withdraw from Canaan after the Bronze Age collapse, the Israelites began to conquer their neighbors. Now, some people believe that the discrepancies between the archaeological evidence and the text of the Bible should discount the latter as a source for the history of the region. However, this is coming from a fundamental misunderstanding of the texts. The narrative from Joshua to Kings is a unified and continuous telling of Israel's story, but it was not a narrative that was content to rehearse dry facts of the situation. Instead, each of the books used its story to make theological points based on the narration of the events. Each book was convinced that it was the nation's sins that had, in each case, brought the people and its succession of leaders in harm's way. Ultimately, archaeology can neither prove nor disprove the Old Testament, only modern theories about what it might mean. Basically, the biblical text has a lot to say about the period, and as covered in previous episodes, it has far too many accurate details about the ancient world to just write it off. And of course, if you treat the Bible this way because of fantastical elements in its narrative, then I have a few other texts you need to reevaluate as well. Now, this video is not meant to be a definitive account of the question, but rather a survey of the current fields of thought around it. If you're interested in reading more about it, I suggest you check out the sources I used for this video down in the description below. If you enjoyed this video but haven't seen the rest of the series, then I suggest you click here to check out that playlist. Here's another video YouTube thinks you'll like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.